Welcome to our second lesson on the character of Mrs Birling. Today we will explore Mrs Birling's second characteristic, her authoritativeness. We will explore the complex dynamics of Mrs Birling's authority in Priestley's play, An Inspector Calls. Our focus will be on how her authoritative stance diminishes over the course of the play, especially during and after her interrogation by the inspector. First, we will examine her initial attempts to assert control over the inspector and other characters. Then, we'll analyse the inspector's control and the power dynamic between him and Mrs Birling. Finally, we will discuss her diminished authority when she directly confronts the inspector. Let's begin. Mrs Birling attempts, and fails, to establish authority over the inspector. In Act 2, she asserts,
"If you think you can bring any pressure to bear upon me, Inspector, you're quite mistaken. Unlike the other three, I did nothing I'm ashamed of or that won't bear investigation. So if I prefer not to discuss it any further, you have no power to make me change my mind."
To which the inspector replies,
"Yes, I have."
Mrs Birling's words and tone suggest a sense of superiority and confidence, as she believes herself to be beyond reproach and unyielding. She uses phrases like "quite mistaken" to assert dominance and shut down the conversation. However, her attempt to establish control is quickly dismantled by the inspector's blunt response, "Yes, I have," which leaves her authority shattered. By demonstrating Mrs Birling's inability to maintain her authoritative stance, Priestley underscores the power dynamics at play and highlights the inspector's unwavering control over the situation. Notice the greater power of the inspector's brief speech compared to Mrs Birling's. Mrs Birling's attempts to establish authority over the inspector get weaker and falter. We see this in the exchange between Mrs Birling and the inspector in Act 2. Mrs Birling dismisses Eva Smith's story and brushes off the questioning.
Oh, she had some fancy reason, as if a girl of that sort would ever refuse money.
The inspector sternly warns,
"I warn you, you're making it worse for yourself."
Here, Mrs Birling does not defy the inspector directly, but challenges his authority by avoiding his questions and undermining his investigation. Despite her attempts, the inspector's stern and authoritative tone continually puts her back in her place. The way he speaks to her is almost like a parent scolding a child, highlighting his control and diminishing her authority. This interaction shows that while Mrs Birling tries to maintain her power, the inspector's unyielding demeanour establishes his dominance over her, and her authority dwindles even further. At the end of the play, Mrs Birling's authority over the other characters is completely diminished. We see this in the final act when Mr Birling ring Chief Constable Colonel Roberts to tell him of Inspector Goole. Mrs Birling says,
"Careful what you say, dear."
Here, Mrs Birling refers to Mr Birling as dear. Earlier in the play, she would address him more formally as Arthur when warning him, showing her control and superiority. By using the term dear, it indicates a shift in her approach and reflects a softer, less authoritative stance. This contrast suggests that her dominance and commanding presence over Mr Birling and potentially the other characters has weakened. This change highlights how the events of the play have affected her position within the family. And that brings us to the end of today's lesson. In today's lesson, we explored the dynamics of Mrs Birling's authority in An Inspector Calls and how it diminishes throughout the play. Initially, we saw her assert control over the inspector with confidence, only to have her authority quickly undermined. We then examined how her attempts to maintain power falter in the face of the inspector's unyielding demeanour, highlighting her diminishing influence. Finally, we discussed the significant shift in her interactions with Mr Birling, indicating a loss of her commanding presence. Through these examples, we understand how Mrs Birling's authoritative stance weakens, reflecting Priestley's critique of classist attitudes and the fragile nature of perceived superiority. Keep revising this lesson and see you next time. Watch the rest of the GCSE English Literature course at Sophos Education.